Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome not just a very accomplished professional, a very senior academic, but also a poet and a publisher from the United Kingdom, Mr. Prabhu Guptara. Prabhu, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Kind of you to have me on the show. Delighted to be here.
Thank you. Prabhu is a retired professor. He's a poet and a publisher. He's the managing director of Global Resilience Publishing, and he's a publisher of Salt Desert Media Group Limited and Pipa Ran Books and Media. So, Prabhu, before we talk publishing, tell me about your own amazing journey.
Well, the amazing journey started when I was 8 years old and my father died. He was one of the very, very few Oxford returned people in India at that stage. He was in Lahore, and then, of course, partition happened. He escaped the worst carnage. He and my mother escaped the worst carnage, but came to Delhi as refugees and, of course, had difficulties finding a place to live and all the rest of it, as you know, what happens in these refugee situations. Then he was appointed, he struggled with some low-level jobs to begin with, but then he was appointed head of department of English at the Hindu College in Amritsar. So that's where I grew up from the ages of 3 to 8, which is why I speak Punjabi. And but he died when I was 8 years old, and that's really where the extraordinary journey more particularly began, because then my mother and we, the children, the 3 children, had to come to Delhi, because my mother, as a single woman, had to then find some way of supporting us.
Right.
So she worked day and night, and we children somehow grew up okay. It was a recipe for disaster, really, in every way, socially, economically, and everything else. But we somehow grew up. My intellectual awakening started at St. Stephen's College, to which I was admitted by sheer miracle. And basically, I haven't stopped growing ever since. So I was a late starter in terms of, intellectual things, understanding the world, understanding subjects, and so on. But that's where the journey started. Then I was a political exile from India at the age of 27, when I was not politically active, but I did something stupid in terms of making my views clear in public. And I was on the list for elimination, along with many thousands of others. But my vice-chancellor, I was teaching at the university then, my vice-chancellor intervened personally with Mrs. Gandhi, as a result of which I was given the choice of leaving the country or joining the party, or being eliminated, of course. So, of course, I did not want to be eliminated. I did not want to join the party, so I had only one option. I was brought up as a nationalist, and I never, dreamt of leaving the country. But I found myself, again, in family terms, as a refugee, this time with 107 pounds between my wife and me, 7 pounds which we were officially allowed to take out, and 100 pounds which my wife had saved up. So 107 pounds we had between us when we arrived in Scotland initially, and then England. And of course, we had to do all kinds of things to survive. So, she typed theses at the university to earn money. I washed dishes and waited at tables and checked tickets and, the usual immigrant story. And then gradually got started with writing for the British press as a freelancer, working for BBC as a freelancer, radio and TV, and eventually, of course, independent television as well, which meanwhile I was developing my consultancy work. And the consultancy work then took off, thank God. And eventually I ended up being an advisor to the world's largest bank, what was then the world's largest bank, where I worked for 21 years till retirement. And then came back to England for family reasons, and have been based here ever since. 7 years ago, I came back here.
Amazing.
And then, of course, my wife was diagnosed with cancer more or less immediately after we returned to England. I spent 2 years nursing her. And then when she was promoted to heaven, I was, of course, in shock and grief, and thinking, when I began to recover 5 months later, I thought I should do something in her memory. What shall I do? Then it came very, very clearly to me that I should start this publishing effort in her memory, because she had started something just before we moved to Switzerland, totally unexpectedly, suddenly, very quickly. without much warning or anything. So everything which he had started in the publishing world, of course, dried up. And so I took up the mantle, and at the age of 70, not knowing anything about publishing, was very fortunate in my mentors, was very fortunate, well, sheer miracle, really, that got me distribution in India with Penguin, India and 16 other countries with Penguin. And I did not realize how great a miracle that was till I tried to get distribution here in the UK, where I'm sitting, where people can meet me, right? Where people have heard me on radio and television and seen my articles in newspapers, right? I did not understand how big a miracle it was to get distribution in India, because it took me 2 years of knocking on the doors, with my emails not being answered, phones not being responded to, and so on, before the door opened again, quite miraculously. Now, of course, I have a global distribution system. So my books are distributed in the UK and Europe by Marston, which is the largest distributor here, and by the Independent Publishers Group in the United States and Canada, which is the largest importer of British books into North America.
Wow.
And as a result of that, now self-published authors, small independent publishers are coming to me for distribution. So I have a publisher from Kuwait, I have a publisher from Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, Spain. So it's quite fascinating how the whole thing has developed. So I'm now not only in publishing, but I'm also in distribution.
Amazing, amazing. I wonder if you've sat down to write your own book, because what an amazing story you've had,
God willing, one of these days I should sit down and write it.
Okay.
But at the moment, publishing is a 24-hour occupation.
I can imagine.
Yes, I had to learn at the age of 70 and establish myself at the age of 70, from the age of 70 onwards. And of course, when you start in a new industry at the age of 70, nobody takes you seriously. Who's going to take you seriously? Old man, starting as if he's a youngster.
Well, you and I are of a similar vintage, so I understand what you're saying. Absolutely.
Yes.
So the publishing is something which I've been involved with so many different publishers, and I'm delighted to learn that you were distributing with Penguin, because Penguin was my first publisher, or they published my first book. But tell me, Prabhu, what are some of the big challenges the publishing industry is facing today?
Well, there are two big challenges. One is consolidation in the industry, and consolidation means that the top 5 publishers, which basically control most publishing in the world, are obviously looking for the bestsellers. So their publishing tends to be driven by the search for bestsellers. And it means that tiddly publishers like myself are left with non-bestsellers, which is okay. But we tend to be focused on trying to get the best quality, because it's only the quality that will make a difference in the long run. And as you know, most publishers make a loss on most of the books they publish, and it's only the 1 or 2 bestsellers they have that give them enough money to keep going. So small publishers have this, independent publishers have this difficult challenge of looking for the bestseller they can get and the best quality they can get. So that's one challenge as a result of the consolidation of the publishing industry. The other challenge is, of course, that on the one hand, you've got technology coming in at a very rapid pace, which is changing the whole business model quite quickly. On the other hand, consumer behavior has changed. So a lot of people now do not read at all, which is a huge pity, because you cannot learn to think substantially, systematically. You cannot learn to engage with the big issues in the world if you're just reading tweets. And so I think publishers are performing a very important job, which the public doesn't really understand, because it's besotted, completely, charmed and taken away by the rapid fire nature of the world in which we live.
You're so right. You're so right. And what kind of support do you, through your publishing companies, offer to first-time authors?
Well, when I started, of course, I did not know anyone. So I approached people. And as I approached people, most of these were first-time authors. I mean, if you're already an established author with Penguin, why would you come to me?
Right.
So I was, of course, working with first-time authors, and I had to give huge amounts of support to bring the books to public publishable standard. Not in every case, but in many cases. Now, of course, as the number of books I have has grown, and as my systems are not yet set up for me to be able to offer the kind of personal attention I was doing to first-time authors, it is more difficult for me to do that. And I have to grow to a stage where I have full-time staff doing the kinds of things that I'm engaged with at the moment, so that I can then come back to focusing on first-time authors. But I'm a one-man army. Everything happens from this table in front of me. I, of course, use freelancers.
Yeah.
I have to use specialists because I'm not the world's best cover designer. I'm not the world's best technical man, preparing manuscripts to the printer and so on. I'm not the world's best marketer. So I need to employ these professionals in order to get the work done. But basically, I'm a one-man army.
Yeah.
And once I grow a little more and I'm able to have full-time staff, which will happen soon, God willing, then, of course, I'll be able to come back to giving more personal attention to first-time authors, which I love to do.
Absolutely. And believe me, I mean, you know, I was a first-time author. The amount of support one needs is incredible.
Yes.
Thank you for everything that you're doing for first-time authors.
Well, interestingly enough, Ashutosh, many first-time authors, at least some first-time authors, don't realize they need support and are quite offended when you offer them support. I've had one person withdraw completely when the book was a good writer, not a bad writer. But you think a journalist who's a good writer is not necessarily a good book writer.
Correct. Very well said. So my next question, Prabhu, is that, and you mentioned it very briefly, but how has the rise of digital media affected traditional publishing? And where do you see, reading on digital platforms like the Kindle or the phone, etc.? Where do you see that heading?
Some people will continue to prefer reading on Kindle.
I agree.
And that's fine. Others will continue to prefer reading physical books.
Yeah.
That's fine. But I think the real change that digital publishing has brought about is that individuals can now load their own material onto Kindle and think they've published a book. So the explosion in self-publishing has been the real change.
Yeah.
And the difficulty with self-publishing is that unless you're a very good marketer or have anyway a huge following, you're a celebrity of some sort, unless you're that kind of person, self-publishing is bound to fail.
Correct.
Meaning you may sell 200 copies of your book to friends, relatives, and numerous other hangers-on, but, is that publishing?
Absolutely.
You could have printed 200 copies and handed them out personally in exchange for a donation rather than going through the whole palaver. And there is a kind of illusion, that if you load a book onto Amazon, it will somehow sell. Just because a book is on Amazon does not mean it is discoverable. I mean, if I wrote a book on French cuisine, and you were looking, Ashutosh, for a book on French cuisine, and you put it into Amazon, French cuisine, best book, or just French cuisine, what are the chances that my book would come up?
Absolutely right.
Zilch, right? Now, if you were looking for a book on French cuisine by Prabhu Guptara, then of course you get it.
Yeah.
But that is not a question of discoverability. That means you are already informed, you already discovered the book, and now you're just looking for it.
Correct.
So for those who are looking for a book, Amazon is a great aid, but it's not a great aid from the author's point of view or the publisher's point of view, seeking to make his or her book known, because the algorithms are never going to pick up, a first-time author, a second-time author, a third-time author who is not already able to command the kinds of sales that put you in the first page of the algorithm results on Amazon.
These are such wise words. I've had so many discussions with people who says we'll self-publish. And I say, listen, for the first-time author, the most important thing is to see your book printed and on the shelf at an airport, so that at least you can say my book is there. And the self-published book, it's not going to be there,
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you for these amazing thoughts that you've given us. My next question to you is, and again, this is often asked by friends, someone wrote to me today, that what role does an editor play? And should a first-time author appoint their own editor? I'd love to get your perspective.
There are advantages to a first-time author employing a professional editor, because the professional editor can get the most obvious things out of the way. The disadvantage is, of course, that the editor's style may not suit the publishing house concerned for whatever reason. And the publishing house will anyway employ their own editor. So the advantage of employing an editor for an author is that he or she can get the book past the slush pile, as it's called in the publishing industry.
Yeah.
That means I get 20, 25 books every day, and I have a quick look at them, and most of them will end up in the slush pile, meaning I've had a quick look at it, not really probably of interest. And then there's a second pile, this is maybes. And then there's the third pile, which is most promising. And even from the most promising, they may not all get picked.
Yeah.
So from the author's point of view, the big thing is to get past the slush pile. And what gets you into the slush pile? You open the book, and there are spelling mistakes, there are grammatical mistakes. The paragraphs are not properly structured. The book is not properly structured. There isn't an argument from beginning to end, or there isn't a story from beginning to end within a chapter or within a book. So a publisher or anybody who's reading the book is going to look at the first few pages and say, not very good quality, and put it in the slush pile. Or is going to look at it and say, oh, pretty interesting, but on balance, probably slush pile. So the author's job is to get past the slush pile. That's where an editor can help you.
Very well. Very well said. Thank you. My next question, Prabhu, is that how do you tackle, as a publisher, ethical dilemmas in publishing?
Well, I think the most important ethical dilemma being created by the publishing models we have today is what is called the hybrid model. And by the hybrid model is meant that the publisher is not, as was traditional, staking his or her or their own money on a book, meaning saying, I think this book is of sufficient quality and interest for me to put my money and time and energy and so on behind this book. So publishing is like a gamble, right? You are betting on a horse, right? And so most of the time in the traditional model, the betting was honest.
Yeah.
Meaning the man or woman was prominent enough, the work was good enough for the bet to be considered worthwhile.
Right.
The hybrid model brings in the question, book is really not actually that good, but the man is offering to buy, or the company or whatever is offering to buy 1,000 copies, 10,000 copies. Do I publish it or do I not publish it? And in today's world, because of the commercial pressures on individuals and on the industry, the tendency, I suspect, is just to say, yeah, we'll do the best we can with this book. Because after all, it's not our money that's at stake. Well, only a small amount of our money is at stake. Obviously, some time and energy is at stake. So the hybrid model, I think, brings up lots of dilemmas, which are not always negotiated in the best way, which is why some publishers have divided their publishing between their own publishing and hybrid publishing and distinguish between them quite clearly, which is a good way to do it, because then you're saying, this is what I regard as good quality. This is what I would publish anyway. And these are the things I'm publishing, even though I'm not quite sure of them.
Very interesting. So one more question regarding publishing that I want to talk to you about your poems. What innovations do you think will shape the future of publishing?
So gaming is one of the things that I'm looking at, and I've put several of my books into gamified form. What does gamification mean? You know, of course, that electronic games have become extremely popular, and reading has declined in the younger population. So some of us are experimenting with seeing whether gamification would interest young people to come back into reading. What does that mean? I've got a book on the first page of which there are 3 paragraphs. Each paragraph becomes a screen on the computer for the child to read, assuming it's a child-friendly book. Could be a late learner, could be an old learner, or somebody who has not read a lot, now wants to start reading. And the game consists in how quickly you can read it, and that is timed, and a score is kept. And you can see that it took you 20 seconds to read that, or 1 minute, or whatever. And the machine will tell you, you are 1 million, whatever it is, in the list of people who read it in terms of your ranking. Let's see if you can read the next paragraph faster. Right? So it becomes an incentive to read faster. But at the same time, you're asked questions about the paragraph to see whether you have understanding of the material or not. And so you might score 60%, 40%, 80%, 99%.
Mm.
And of course, you realize, oh, I read very fast, but my comprehension dropped.
Mm.
So it becomes like biofeedback, it becomes intellectual reading feedback.
Mm.
And it's being reasonably successful so far. I can't claim that it's earth-shakingly successful,
Mm.
but it's being reasonably successful. And I think that will be one of the kinds of innovations that will take us forward. The other is, of course, that making films, just as publishing books has become very easy, making films has become very easy.
Yeah.
And so as we're going from physical books to electronic books, and from physical and electronic books to audio books, people are even going into self-producing movies of their books.
Wow.
Which is very interesting. And on the other hand, there are movies that are being made into films more and more. So it used to be always books into movies, but as you know, in recent decades, we've also had movies into books.
Mm.
And I think that's not a bad thing, because it means people get interested in the content of a book, start reading a book, and they will go on to read other books. So that's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Prabhu, I'm going to now ask you about your poems. You have published several poems. Tell me a little bit about the kind of genre that you write poems about.
Well, Ashutosh, I was 20 years old. I had never
Mhm.
written a poem in my life. I had read lots of poems in Hindi, of course. I had read some Sanskrit poems. I had read poems in English. I'd never written a poem. But as a result of a particular experience, I wrote one very short poem.
Mhm.
And one of my friends, who was actually far more literary than I was, far
Mhm.
more of a scholar and a bit of an entrepreneur than I was, said to me, Prabhu, that poem is brilliant. You must send it off to Nissim Ezekiel.
Mhm.
I said, Nissim Ezekiel,
Okay.
towering personality.
Mhm.
You know, editing at that time,
Mhm.
every month, a page of poetry in the Illustrated Weekly of India,
Yeah,
which was the largest circulation
I know.
magazine in those days.
Mhm.
So I didn't want to send it off. I felt too hesitant. My first poem, okay, it's good, but it can't be that good. No, you must send it off.
Mhm.
So in order not to upset my friend, I
Mhm.
sent it off to Nissim Ezekiel. And the next thing I know, it appears in the Illustrated Weekly of India.
Amazing.
And the following thing that happens, astonishingly, is that Professor P. Lal from Calcutta
Mhm.
writes to me
Mhm.
and says, this is a very good book. This is a very good poem. Do you have other poems? And would you like to publish a collection?
Wow.
One poem,
Amazing.
you get an offer to publish a book.
Yeah.
So you
Mhm.
can imagine I'm scribbling away furiously, trying to get a book together. Excuse me. So that's what resulted in my first book of poems being published
Okay.
by Pilal,
Mhm.
Writer's Workshop, and then a second collection of poems being published by Pilal. Then I edited an anthology of Indian poetry in English,
Mhm.
Indian religious poetry in English,
Mhm.
and I edited the selected poems of Leela Dharmaraj, I think a vastly underrated
Mhm.
poet. So having done all those kinds of things, I kind of continued to write poetry, but
Mhm.
because life then took over, marriage, children, coming to the UK, etc.,
Mhm.
I continued to write poetry. I still continue to write poetry, but it is occasional.
Mhm.
And it is when a moment is squeezed out of the rest of the press of life that I can get to write a poem.
How
I write
fascinating.
many different kinds of poems. Some
Mhm.
are poems for children, some are poems for adults, some are very intellectual poems, some are funny poems. In fact, a literary critic who I know says my best poems are my funny poems.
Mhm. Amazing.
I write political poems. I write nature poems. I write love poems, all kinds of poems. Yes.
Incredible. Incredible. I must try and find some of your one of the two books published and go through your poems. But
Thank
probably
you. Very kind.
my last question to you, and this is for the many, many, many people who will listen to our conversation. Given your understanding of books, writing as a publisher, and the fact that you've got two published books yourselves on poetry, what would you say are three lessons for aspiring authors?
First of all, write what you're passionate about.
Mm.
Secondly, write as well as you possibly can, which means revise
Mm.
yourself.
Mm.
And third is get professional help to get it to the best possible standard.
Mm.
And I'll add in a fourth one, go with the biggest publisher and the best publisher you can.
Mm. Wonderful. And on that note, and your amazing lessons, Write what you're passionate about, revise, get professional help, and go with the biggest publisher you can find. Thank you, Prabhu, for speaking to me about your own amazing journey. I sincerely hope I'll see someday your book on your journey and what took you to England and what were some of the imperatives that made you leave India. Thank you for talking to me at such length about publishing. I thought I knew a little bit about publishing, but I learned many new things about publishing from you today. Thank you again
Very
also
kind of you to say
to
so.
me for about your
Thank you.
poetry.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Good luck.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.